Welcome back, listeners and even viewers on the Arcade Attack podcast. I've got another super guest on today's show, a true gaming legend, American McGee. America, thank you so much for your time today. You know, you've seen it all, you've done it all. You know, part of id Software, launching the Alice games as well. Really is an honor to have you on today's show. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Nice to be here today.
Thank you. Before we talk about your kind of career in gaming, would you be okay to sort of start off about, you know, maybe explaining your rather unusual name? I mean, it's a cool name, I have to say. I love it, but it's quite iconic. It's quite unusual. But how did you get your name, if you're happy with me to ask?
I wish I had one, concise answer for that, or one consistent answer for that. The problem is that everybody that I talk to about this in my family, they all give me different answers.
Right.
So some of them will say that it was my mom's idea because she knew a woman at university who had, I think, named her daughter America, which is a very common name in Central and South America, by the way, for girls. And then my mom said that, she thought that, American would be a good version of that for a boy. I also heard that my father saw it on a wall somewhere in the hospital. My mom told me she also was thinking of the name Obnard, O-B-N-A-R-D, which means nothing. So, look, it was the 70s, I think, is the best way to describe what was going on, right? A lot of pot smoking, a lot of hippie free love, this kind of thing. That's probably the easiest way to describe it.
No, yeah, fair enough. Very cool. While you were growing up then, did you play a lot of video games? Did you have any consoles or computers in your house? And do you have any particular really good early memories of video games?
Well, I grew up pretty poor. So it wasn't until I think I was 13 years old that I got my first own kind of computer thing, which back in that era was a Timex Sinclair 2000, which was essentially like a calculator you could plug into your television, so you weren't really going to be playing a lot of games on that. But I think my earliest, introduction to video games was arcade machines. I'd walk home from school and there'd be Dig Dug and there'd be Moon Patrol and there'd be, Asteroids. And I mean, we're talking, Defender, like that era, right? So in terms of the kinds of games that, I eventually got into making, obviously there wasn't anything on a level of sort of graphics or storytelling to make me think like, oh, I want to go on to make games. But around, in my teens, I did finally get a Commodore 64, and I began poking around making my own, sort of little dungeon crawlers and things like that. But even at that age, I can remember playing games and thinking games were fun, but I just didn't have this notion that like I myself would go on to make games. I was very interested in storytelling and in writing, but it just hadn't crossed my mind that like that was a path that I could even pursue.
What sort of stories were you interested in back then? Were you reading a lot of classic novels and things, or?
Oh yeah, I mean, as a kid, I was a voracious reader. In fact, because I never finished high school due to family instability, I guess would be the word.
Right.
I was out of the house at a very very young age, and I was forced to drop out of school as a result. But when I dropped out of high school, I remember getting in trouble as the last thing as I was leaving, because they had opened up my locker and several lockers next to my locker where I had been stealing books from the library and putting them in the locker. And I had a bunch of them at home, and I think they figured that out. And they're like, could you bring back all the books that we think you stole? But at that time I was a big fan of a range of things. If it was sort of classical horror like Mary Shelley or Edgar Allan Poe, but I was also really into science fiction. I remember in high school, I got really into like Arthur C. Clarke, and I sort of then transitioned into Heinlein. So sort of fantasy, sci-fi type of stuff. Very big fan of sort of just adventure in general, Robinson Crusoe type stuff. And I think that followed over eventually into the types of stories I like telling, adventure tales, but of course with a very psychological kind of surreal twist to them.
Oh, we'll talk about those later for sure. Again, I don't want to get too like personal of your personal life and things, but I think you said in previous interviews that you did have a bit of you hinted earlier a bit of an unconventional childhood. Obviously, I don't want to bring up bad memories and whatnot, but do you think that did have an influence about how your career, where it took you, and even subconsciously about some of the stories and the games you develop and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think that we as individuals, much less as creators or storytellers, each one of us is a creator. We are all storytellers in some fashion, that's sort of like the point of us being put on this planet is to bring order to chaos to some degree. And the way in which we organize things is itself a function of the environment in which we were raised and the way in which we found to organize the chaos in our lives, right? And so as an extension of that, like you'll hear it often said that, when you find a storyteller, that's successful at storytelling, oftentimes they're telling the same tale over and over again. And that tale at its core is something that is their story. It's deeply personal to them. And so I think that my childhood, it was tumultuous. It was unusual. It was creative in some fashion. It was also, there were a lot of destructive elements in it. But it was the exposure to those things and the learning how to overcome those things that gave me my voice as a creator. Like one of the things that I'm really big into is asking people not to shy away from those things about themselves, instead to kind of run towards them and embrace those things, as difficult as that may be, because in that process of accepting who you are, that's a transformative process. You get out of that the gold of being a creator, right? You get out of that the stuff that you have to, it's difficult to earn, but it's what makes you have an original or a genuine voice.
Embrace it, what good advice, actually. Thank you. I'd love to know, actually, because you said earlier you never really thought as a child that you wanted to, even thought about getting into video games as a job, and you said you didn't finish high school. Are you happy to kind of fill in the gaps a little bit about how that led to? How did you get the opportunity, and what were you doing before you got into video games?
Sure. This is before the interview started. I mentioned this story's been told a lot, so I apologize to the people who've heard this before, but I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who haven't. I dropped out of high school and I bounced around to a couple of different sort of nonsense dead-end jobs, but I eventually settled on car mechanic because I have car mechanics working in my family, and I had one uncle in particular who took me under his wing, and he sort of brought me into the shop where he was working. So I spent some years working in a shop that specialized with German cars, BMWs and Volkswagens and Mercedes, that kind of thing. And I think I got to be pretty good at it. I mean, I like tools. I have a crazy workshop here full of like every tool imaginable,
Nice.
Lathes and 3D printers and you name it. So I'm very hands-on, mechanical. So that it really kind of suited me in a lot of ways. But in the midst of that, I happened to move to a new apartment complex in Mesquite, Texas, and that is where I met John Carmack because he also was living there. We became friends. He invited me up to id a couple of times to test this new game they were working on called Doom. And I was really blown away because at the car shop where I was working, I had convinced the owner there to buy I think it was a 386. And I was trying to basically digitize their inventory control, their inventory in general. I was trying to build this database for all the inventory in the shop. And so I had been playing Wolfenstein on this thing.
Yeah.
And little did I know that I'm living in the same compound as the guys that made this. I started going up to their office, and at some point John took me aside and said, look, it seems like you're kind of wasting your time working on cars. Would you like to come work in my office? And the original offer was to be there to answer phones. So I was wearing a headset, much like the one that you're wearing, and I was doing tech support. People would call and say, hey, your game blew up my house, or your game, destroyed my computer or whatever. And it would be my job, along with Sean Green, to talk them through their problem and get their game up and running. So that was how I ended up in the door at id.
I mean, that's a great story. Did you always get on with John Carmack? Was he a bit of a mentor for you, or was it he got you in, you didn't really see him again? Or I mean, that How would you reflect on that relationship?
Yeah, well, I felt that he also took me under his wing. He clearly saw something in me that he wanted to nurture. It may have been my life story that appealed to him somehow, that I was out on my own and struggling at such an early age. I think he also saw my passion for and knowledge about computers. And so he must have recognized something that he wanted to try to help out. But no one really knew, even I didn't know until I sat down with the game editor, that I had a propensity, a skill for doing level design. But in terms of my relationship with him, I mean, yeah, we became quite close. In fact, we ended up buying houses right next door to each other. So we were neighbors for some years. But I think it's well known that John is a particular, sort of personality type. He's, I think, for a lot of people in the company at that time, it's difficult to get very close to him because he really is a workaholic, and he's very much constantly in his head around the problems that he's trying to solve. But I think that I was, able to enjoy some kind of closeness to his thought process and him as an individual for some years there, especially when we were working on Quake. I worked really closely with him from the initial development of the engine and the editor and the scripting language. There was a very nice collaboration that took place between the two of us at that time. But things changed, and everybody kind of went their own separate ways. And these days, I've seen him at trade events and things like that. He's still perfectly friendly and happy to see each other. But I now live in China, which means there's a lot of distance between me and the people I used to know in those days.
I've spoken to Bill Raybach before. I don't know if he worked at Atari, and he was telling the story that I think John Carmack could get Doom on the Atari in a weekend. He managed to get it in the car, and it's a very good port. Apparently, well, it's a good port, but it just shows you the workaholic and the man he was, I guess. Amazing, really.
Yeah.
So id Software, obviously, Wolfenstein came out, massive game, but you were working on Doom. What was your initial role? Was it testing firstly that he sort of rose through the ranks? Is that right, American? Yeah.
Yeah. So by the time I had started working there, Doom was already released.
Oh, right. Okay.
I had tested on Doom, but I hadn't had any development role on it at all. Then on Doom 2, I actually ended up building maps that went into the game. And there were a couple of sort of level packs or map pack type releases. And I was involved with those. And then I worked on Quake and Quake 2 and some more, sort of level packs and some other related products and ports and stuff in between. But primarily, I mean, when I talk about people, what did I do? It's safe to say like early Doom and Quake stuff. That was kind of it.
Have you played like the most recent Doom games, for example? Are you a fan of FPS titles personally?
Yeah, I did play the most recent one for about an hour. And it's so I'm embarrassed to say this, but a lot of games these days become so frantic that I don't get a lot of enjoyment out of it anymore. It's funny, like I can really enjoy a game like Red Dead Redemption, the new one, or Days Gone, where it's got these moments of action, but you're doing a lot of exploring and you're kind of enjoying the environment, and there's a story and things like that. So when it comes to like a Doom type FPS thing, and it's the same if I try to go back and play a deathmatch now, I don't enjoy the feeling of the adrenaline rush that comes into my body from playing those types of games. And that's not to knock on people who want to play things like that. It's just that it doesn't appeal to me much anymore. But I did play that most recent Doom, and it's interesting to see the technical art and the literal art of it, the sounds and the graphics and everything. It's amazing. I mean, it's just amazing where the technology has gone, especially when you go back and you look. If you go back and play Doom right now, and it's at 320 by 200, it's impossible to understand that at some point in our history, we would look at that and say that that was high resolution and it was incredible graphics and it was amazing and it was immersive, because now it just looks like a mess of pixels. It's hard to even understand what it is you're looking at sometimes. But back in the day when you looked at that, you were there, you felt it. You were like hairs on the back of your neck, and it was crazy. So it's I think also really interesting to me just to kind of see how our brains were so active in filling in the gaps. Whereas these days, I think you don't have to work as hard to fill the gaps in because it's all done for you.
Interesting. I mean, do you reflect very positively, or I suppose differently, working for id and working on Doom and Quake? I mean, it's huge titles. Let's be completely honest, absolutely incredible titles. How do you feel about looking back at that time? Do you think it did shape your career quite a lot?
Well, for sure. But, at the same time, like, if you had asked me this question, 1 year after I left id, 5 years, 10 years, as time goes by, I mean, what are we talking? 20, 30 years.
It's crazy, isn't it?
We're coming up on, I was 20 years old. I will be 50 this year. So we're talking 30 years ago that I was working on those. So, it's kind of funny. I don't even know that I really retain proper memories of the stuff. I think I just retain the sort of voice pattern for recalling the events, because it all seems like such a distant memory now. It's hard to remember anything but these very particular highlights. But for sure, it had an absolutely huge bearing on my career back in those days. But since then, I've managed to reinvent myself multiple times over. So it's like, that was cool, but I mean, that was a really long time ago.
No, thank you, Aaron. Last question really on, before we move on to you working in electronic arts and so forth, is, again, I know you've answered this question before, and I feel a bit bad asking because no one wants to talk about getting fired, but you did mention, I think in a previous interview, that it was an important event for you. Whether it was a fun event is a different question, but are you happy just to explain, reiterate, and maybe go in a little bit of depth why it was important for you being fired by id and what happened maybe?
Well, first of all, I find this topic fascinating simply because depending on who you ask about this, you will get different answers. And I've always tried to remain relatively neutral, simply for the fact that the easiest way for me to explain what happened is to say I don't know, because it really came out of the blue for me. I'm sitting there working on maps one day. I get called into the art room for a meeting. All of the owners of id, Adrian and Kevin and John, are there. And they go, we want to talk to you about something. We're going to let you go. And, it was it was a shock, because it was like, what are you talking about? We just finished Quake 2. And on Quake 2, if you go and look at the, sort of the credits list for that, you'll see that I produced a tremendous amount of content for that game. Not any more or less than anyone else who worked on it. Right. And also in terms of quality, if you ask people about the maps that I produced in there, those are some of the maps that people consider their favorites in that game. So, clearly something happened that was over my head. But it wasn't until years later that I had other people who were working there at the time come out and say, this guy torpedoed you and, you were done wrong. I don't know about that stuff. But here's the thing. If I was the victim of political subterfuge and there was someone there who managed to get me fired unfairly, I would like to say to that person, thank you, because the resulting journey, and it's funny because I experienced this even before I understood that I might have been booby trapped or whatever the word would be. I understood this when I was fired and a week later, because the initial reaction to being fired was shock and depression and sadness and just a general kind of what the fuck, right? Mm-hmm. But about a week later, I found myself experiencing this crazy sense of relief because I was no longer in a situation where I was expected to go and work for 18 hours a day, 6 days a week. And remember, that was the default.
Yeah,
And I had been doing that there for years without really questioning it. And there was a kind of psychological pressure going on that I think was very unhealthy for the people that were involved in it. And not just psychological pressure, physical pressure as well, right? I mean, fortunately, we were young. If I tried to do that these days, I'd just keel over and die. So anyway, I eventually found myself feeling great relief. And then because of being fired, that ended up in my transitioning to a whole different world. I ended up leaving Texas and moving to California, which I loved. I went and worked at EA, which I loved. And I got to make a game and put my name on it, which was incredible.
Pretty cool.
I was like, well, again, if there was somebody behind my being fired and their goal they thought was to make my life poorer as a result, they failed. And again, I'd like to say thanks, because that was a huge favor was done for me. Yeah.
And again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you mentioned that you got like resilience from your childhood. Maybe that helped as well a little bit and brought you back off the canvas. And look what happened.
I hadn't learned that stuff at that age. I was only 24 years old.
Oh,
right?
Fair enough. Yeah.
And think about it. Like, if you're going to be in a rock star game development company and you're going to be fired from it, I mean, best to do it early on, right? And then you still have many years to go to bounce back and reinvent yourself and stuff like that. So again, I mean, I can't look back on any of that stuff with any sort of upset or anger or whatever. And again, the timing was perfect. I mean, it ended up putting me on another path that ended up towards lots of great stuff happening. And then that path ended and put me on a different path. There's this Chinese proverb about a guy who, he's riding his horse, he falls off and breaks his leg, and he thinks that that's a bad thing. But the next day the army comes through and is collecting all of the men of fighting age to take them off and sacrifice them in battle. And so the little story goes on and on. Like, every time there's a bad twist in his life, he initially thinks of it as something that's not good. But the next twist, it's like, oh, it's a good thing I broke my leg that day, or I'd be in the army tomorrow, So I tend to look at life like that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't suppose you ever thought where your life would be right now if you weren't fired. Who knows? We'll never know, will we, American? But
who knows? Yeah. Who knows? But I think it is potentially telling. Look at the different paths that everybody took from that first generation of id.
Yeah.
Where are they today? There may be some lessons in that.
Oh, good on you. Let's talk about Electronic Arts. Let's talk about the Alice games, because absolutely incredible. Electronic Arts, huge company again. Let's be honest. But how did that opportunity arrive? You weren't unemployed for long, I take it. You got a good opportunity, and what were your early days at the company like? Was it always Alice, or was there other stuff you did just before then?
Well, it was really weird because the initial path into EA was through Michael Crichton, and the creator of Jurassic Park.
Yes, wow, okay, interesting.
So I got this very strange email or phone call where it was like, would you like to come out to North Carolina? We want you to take a look at this project to know if you want to be a designer on it. And we can't tell you what it is, and we can't tell you anything, but we'll send a plane and you can come out. So I get there, they put me in this tech park. I end up in this tech park in North Carolina. By the way, that's where like Epic is. There's a lot of game development studios or game engine studios there at that time. And so they put me in this white room with it felt weird. It was like a scene out of the Matrix or something. And they're like, what do you want to drink? And I said, I have a Coke or something. Well, the guy who comes and brings the Coke in is Michael Crichton. And the most bizarre thing about this was that my fiance at the time had been reading this book called Travels, which is his autobiography. And she had given it to me, and I just started reading it, and I was really engrossed. And I'm like, this Michael Crichton guy is really cool because, he's super smart. He went to university, did his doctoral degree in medicine at the same time that he was writing all these novels that were blowing up, Andromeda Strain and stuff like that. And so and then he ejects out of the medical business straight into Hollywood, and invented ER and did all this stuff. Yeah. So I'm reading this book, and I'm like, this guy's fucking awesome, And so who walks in the door with the Coke? It's him. And I'm looking at the back of the book, and I'm like, what's going on here? Like, is this a joke? So they invited me to work on this game called Timeline, which is now, you can go and watch this movie called Timeline. You can read the book called Timeline. So I was involved with the genesis of that project in general. Like I would spend time with Crichton talking back and forth on, what is the story? How does the story work? How do we turn this into a game? Stuff like that. So in the middle of all that, then these guys show up, and it turns out they're from EA. And at some point they said, hey, how would you like to be on our team? Because we're going to be the ones to fund this project and see it turned into a game. And we like your style, and we like the way you're interacting with this team, but we want you on our side. And so I went to EA. Then I promptly told them that this project was terrible and they should kill it.
Oh, no.
So, well, because it was the developer that was building it did not know what they were doing. And fortunately, because I made a very difficult call, and it meant also sacrificing what I had in terms of a relationship with Crichton, with this team.
Of course.
So it was an personally expensive decision to make. But I did that. IDOS picked that title up, and then they published it, and I think it sold like one copy. So it validated the decision I made. But that was how I ended up at EA. And initially, they continued to keep me in this role, which was terrible, of going out and doing essentially like due diligence or a sort of like development review process on struggling developers. And I was really good at it. But the problem was I would arrive at these development studios and people would start crying. They'd start running for the doors. Because I basically was turned into the Grim Reaper. And, primarily because I told it like it was. Like if I showed up and things were busted, I would say this is busted. But a lot of times that meant that their budget was gone and that they died. So that was my my first year at EA, and that was how I transitioned to EA as well.
That's mad. You sound like the Doom guy, just destroying all the potential games.
Dude, there was one time that I went to a studio in Texas, and they had split themselves inside their building. The programmer had barred himself behind furniture in his office at one end of a hallway in the building. And the whole rest of the team was in this other room all the way at the other end of the building. I mean, Pete, you think you're going to like look at a game, and sometimes you're literally talking some dude out of a tree who's lost it mentally,
Yeah.
But this goes back to what I was talking about with like, the development culture, at id, where you're working 18 hours a day. A lot of developers were doing that and are still doing that. And so the pressure is incredibly intense. And so many times when you go to talk to these teams about the failings that were happening within their developments, it comes always back to people, and it always comes back to the interaction between personalities. And especially because with game development, you're almost always dealing with the analytical, technical programmer side and the emotional feeling art side. And it's sort of the, my camera thinks I'm talking to it, but I'm not.
Yeah, zoomed in.
So yeah, I mean that oil and water combination of tech and art, when you go to see these projects that are failing, 9 times out of 10, it's that personnel issue, that drives those failures.
Was there any particular games that you helped, in your opinion, launch and turn around American, or was it mainly bad news really in that sense?
I was bad news wherever I went. But at that time, I was at they had me stationed at Maxis while they were working on the Sims. And so I became really close with Will Wright. And I think a lot of people don't know this, but EA in that time tried multiple times to kill The Sims, which then went on to be their most successful, profitable IP ever, right? But while I was there at Maxis, I watched this, and I was in on a couple of these sort of do or die meetings for The Sims. I won't say I had anything to do with, I had absolutely nothing to do with the project surviving. That was on Will and Lucy Bradshaw, who was the lead on those things. But to watch this same sort of dynamic taking place, except internally at EA, it's not a fun thing. It's not a fun thing at all.
No, it doesn't sound it. We can laugh about it, but it's not really funny, is it? When you think about it, it isn't. I've got to ask about Alice then. I've got to ask how that evolved. Were you always a fan of the famous Lewis Carroll story? And was it always in the back of your mind to make this game? Or what inspired you to, and how did that opportunity come to get Alice into fruition then? So
I had read the Alice books when I was a kid, for sure. I remember having them, and I remember reading them, and I remember being an okay fan of them. I mean, not like over the top, but I thought they were interesting. When the time came to do my own game, this came about because I had said to the guys at EA, look, I don't want to be the Grim Reaper anymore. I don't like being the guy who goes out and kills studios. I think they were trying to sort of search around and figure out what to do with me. And one of the president's, studio head guys named Rich Hilleman came and said, well, why don't you propose to make your own game? So come up with an idea, make your own proposal and we'll see if we can make it go. And he hooked me up with artist Terry. Now I've got Rich's last name mixed up with Terry's. Sorry, Terry, you know who you are. But he hooked me up with Terry. Terry hooked me up with Norm, a bunch of artists that surrounded us. Terry Smith. So Rich hooked me up with Terry Smith, and Terry Smith hooked me up with Norm, who ended up working on the Alice game. And together we were kind of ideating, I guess you'd say. I was trying to figure out what would be a great way to show off artistically what these engines could do, because I'd come out of Doom and Quake and I felt like everybody does Space Marines, everybody does guns and violence, but there's so much more that I think these engines could do. And then there was a Heavy Metal Fact 2, was a game that was developed by Ritual in Dallas. And when you saw that game, because it was also built inside of the Quake engine, when you saw that, you were like, wow, these guys are really pushing art into this space in an amazing way. So I started thinking about what's a really artistic, surreal, and it came to me, Alice, but I at the same time had been talking to some friends in music and art, and a bunch of people had brought it up. They were like, man, you should think about Alice as a video game. So it felt like it was the zeitgeist. It felt like a lot of energy around the notion, but the I guess American McGeeifying it, as people would say now, the making her into a little goth chick, that was just kind of the space that I was living in. For a long time, my hair was dyed black, and tattoos, and I was really into wearing all black goth club clothes and stuff. So I think I felt that there was always something dark lurking in those stories, and a lot of people recognized it. They recognized it as a sort of counterculture drug, psychedelic, psychologic type of story, and that no one had really pulled those themes out of there correctly. So we spent some months doing concept sketches and working on story stuff until we felt we'd nailed it. And when I say working on it, I mean we had stacks of art with various different ways of rendering a new Alice character. Some of them were bubblegum anime pop, and some of them were Wild West, and some of them. We kept coming back to this. Now she's got to be this kind of dark goth something, until one day one of the artists just did this really quick rough sketch and was like, "How about that?" And I said, "That's it." Nice. We found it. We nailed it. So, it was an interesting process.
And it's set, isn't it? Correct me if I'm wrong. After Through the Looking Glass, after the second book, so it's kind of the third story, you could argue. But I mean, were you ever tempted to sort of almost retell the first book in your iconic tale, or are you always going to do a brand new story, American?
Well, I always wanted to branch her off, to have a fork in the path, so that we had a more blank canvas to work with. And there's also issues of just making sure that it's something that intellectual property wise you own, right? So it's important when you're doing that to deviate from what everybody expects to some degree. But yeah, I mean, I had a story in there that I wanted to tell related to a very personal and a psychological journey for this character through trauma, and using the tools of her mental landscape to overcome that trauma, because I felt like that was, again, something that in terms of like what games had done to that point in storytelling, no one had really ever done a psychological horror game in that fashion. And so I felt like there's a space there that we can, and it was weird because I just felt like, oh, this is what I'm here for. I have the tools to do this, and for it to be unique. That was what was really important. Yeah. Like I know this voice, and I can make this unique, and it'll play off of the things that I know how to do. Right. So that was how we ended up there.
You said it's definitely an original game, but was there any inspiration for it? Like other video games or media? Obviously, I know the Alice stories, but was there anything else that kind of crept in, or was it,
Well, look, I remember I put together a folder of inspirational stuff. I mean, there was a Rob Zombie song at that time called "Living Dead Girl" that we would play during these presentations. At that time, I was fairly close friends with Marilyn Manson, and nice. I would go over and hang out with him, and we would talk alchemy, and we would talk about psychology, and he actually did a collection of tracks for the original game that never saw the light of day because we never got the licensing figured out, and they were incredible. It was like psychedelic Beatles era meets Marilyn Manson in Wonderland, and they were amazing. So there was a lot of inspiration like that floating around at the time. Musical inspiration, artistic inspiration, like I said. And yeah, I mean, I felt like there was this weird thing happening where I would sit down with people and it just resonated. So, and this was among this group of friends in the film world and the music world and, the game space and writers. So there was a lot of inspiration coming from all over the place.
And those tracks by Marilyn Manson, they've never been released, and they're under lock and key. That's a shame, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, that's lawyers and managers, though. It happens all the time.
I've got to ask about those famous Alice statues that are made, I assume, for the promotion of the game. I think there was 3 of them. They're pretty amazing. Have you ever? I mean, do you own one yourself? If there's only 3 ever made, or any ideas? Or
I assume you're talking about these sort of
the life size.
Yeah. Well, the original, there was a pair of them. I mean, there were like 3 or 4 in total made, but one of the pairs of them used to sit in my office at cool. EA. And then after I left, I saw that they had that pair sitting in the lobby for ages when you would come into the EA building in Redwood Shores. I don't know where in the world they are now. Again, you're talking about 22, 23 years ago. It's quite a long time ago.
Yeah, fair enough. Might be a slightly not rude. Might be a bit of a rude question, really. But you got your name on the title, American McGee's Alice. I'm not saying you didn't do anything in the game industry before then, but this was your first big. I don't know, your first big title. How did you get your name on there, American? I mean, it's a big deal, isn't it? And I'm not trying to be rude, but I'd just like to know it's part of the brand, and how did that happen?
So the thing is that was purely EA, the legal department at EA.
Right.
They were trying to figure out a way to clearly delineate their version of Alice from all other potential versions of Alice, because it is public domain, and at any moment anyone could say, here's an Alice in Wonderland. And they floated they floated a couple of variations just on English names, like Alice in Nightmare Land or, Nightmare Alice or whatever. But they all sounded kind of corny and goofy. But they did do, their kind of their due diligence on trying to determine which of them was the least encumbered and would, be the clearest name for them to own. And clearly, because I have such a weird name, to slap those two things together was going to create a combination that is untouchable, basically. So at the end of the day, that's what they went with. There is a side story to this where, the development team wasn't happy about it, the guys at Rogue, and they had made it clear to me they weren't happy about it. So I went back to EA and said, look, there's a whole team of guys here that's working on this game. They're not very happy about this. And at some point, the EA guys had called me up and said, you tell them not to worry about it. We're not going to call it that. And so I went and told them, hey, good news, everybody. It's not going to happen. And then it happened. And it came as a shock to me that they went ahead with it, and then I had to go egg on my face back to the guys and be like, hey guys, I'm sorry, but they went ahead with this. Of course, from my personal side of the story, aside from being embarrassed and feeling a bit undeserving of it, it was a positive and a beneficial thing to have happen.
It's a great story, and it's quite amazing actually, because it's obviously it's led to many other games in the future, isn't it? That kind of strong branding actually.
Right.
I've got to ask about the PS2 version of Alice. It was in development. Apparently, it was quite close to completion. I'm not totally sure, but how come that never came out? Obviously, it did well on the PC. So there was. I mean, this is classic EA. I mean, I don't think that they'll be shocked to hear that I would say this or that any developer would say this, but they do have a track record of like getting developers out over their own skis and then letting them die, right? Like, right. I don't know how else to put that. I mean, they very often will put a developer in a position that is financially it's a disadvantage to be there, and then they'll pull the rug out from under them, and then the guys they'll just die. And I think that from their perspective, it's just like, well, it's just business. It's not. Of course, for the people who are affected by things like this, it's not just business. This is their studio they've built. It's their livelihood. It's something akin to family to them. But that was the case with Rogue. They were given the contract for the initial development of the game. They delivered on that. I believe that they delivered on that in timely fashion, and obviously built a good game. They were then, I think, loaned or given the money. No. They were told they would be given the money to do the PlayStation version. Now, this is on them, but they stupidly went out and bought all of the development equipment for PlayStation 2 development, and they began development because they're like, hey, life is great. We knocked this out of the park. Why would EA not give us this deal? Well, EA didn't give them the deal. At the end, the EA guys decided to pull the plug on that. Now, why? I'm not sure, because the game went on and it sold quite well. Mm-hmm. It probably would have done very well as a console title, but you have to keep in mind it was EA's first ever M-rated game, and I had heard rumor of the then CEO, I think it was Larry, who held the Alice game up in a board meeting and was like, we will not be known for making stuff like this, and was shaking it and was angry. So it could be that somehow the game got made, and it wasn't until it was on the shelves that he got word that they'd done an M-rated game. I don't freaking know. Which is weird, because I used to jog with him in the morning, and there was me with like blue and black hair and spikes, and like I'm on the jogging machine and we're chatting. And I mean, he knew I was there. He knew I was working on a big game for them. So I never really understood it, but they pulled the plug, and it killed the studio. It was just gone. So that was a very, very sad thing. I remember getting the email from Jim Molinetz at Rogue, which was like, we're done. EA's killed us. And so this is just... it was crying out for a console release, wasn't it?
It was.
Let's be honest.
I think it would have done quite well.
I mean, it is still playable today. I think you can get it on Steam, but do you not think the first game or even the first two games could be re-released, remastered, maybe on the Switch console, bring it to the home consoles? Is there a chance that could ever happen, do you think? Or
yeah, I mean, so I think that the games themselves could do quite well. The problem is, I'm not sure if anybody knows exactly where all the source code is. Again, you're talking about a 20-year-old game.
Yeah.
So I think there's an issue of not having access to the source code. But then beyond that, it's funny because I see comments like this quite often online. People will write a comment like, well, why don't you just remaster and put it on the Switch? And they're pissed off about it. And you're like, hey, guy, I know you think that that's just like an app on your phone and you press the button and it's like remaster and it's on the Switch, but it's not like that, right? I mean, it's a team and it requires time and effort. And so at a minimum, you're talking some big chunk of money to do that work. And then you got to launch it and you got to market it and the way EA thinks about this, if they can't do a 20x return on whatever they put into it, they're not going to do it. But I think that where there is hope for that is if we do manage to make a third game, we could try to bundle that all up in there. We could have a new game plus the bundle of the remastered original in the second game.
Yeah, I'll talk about the new game in a minute. Some of the sort of boss fights in Alice are pretty cool. Who's your favourite character, though, from the Alice in Wonderland universe? Have you got a particular favourite character?
I quite like the Mad Hatter in the games because he's kind of tortured. He's kind of discombobulated, I guess would be the word. He seems to me to be the person most aware of what it is that's going on and where they are and why they are, and I mean on a deeper level, like I think he gets that they're all a function of Alice's psyche. So he's the self-aware part of her brain, right? And so I like him for that. And I think that because of the self-awareness is kind of what makes him a little bit mad, makes him a little bit crazy.
Would you go to his tea party then? I think for a quick drink.
For sure. I think everyone in their life, this is a coded bit of advice. Everyone in their life should at least once enjoy some of the Mad Hatter's tea. Open up some insights and revelations I think many people need to have.
Brilliant. No, thank you. Let's talk about the sequel really quickly. So Alice Madness Returns. That came out a few years later. Was that another EA game or was that your own sort of development? And how do you try and move on from the original?
Well, Madness Returns is still owned by EA because it's all within the same IP. But at that time, it was my studio in Shanghai, China, that developed the game, beginning to end. So that was a major undertaking. I think it was the first time that a Chinese development team had completed an entire AAA console title under one roof, in China like that for a Western console title. And it was a big project, 2 years and totally like 300 something people worked on it, 100 in our studio and then another 200 or so outsourced people doing art and animation and stuff like that. So, I mean, it was big. It was a lot of fun. And I think it turned out pretty good. If you go look at the reviews and you watch people playing it on YouTube these days, I mean, it seems like it still holds up. People still seem to think it looks pretty good and plays pretty well. So, yeah, it's all right.
And obviously, you moved to China in between the two Alice games. Is that right? In American? And can I ask why? It's a massive, huge, isn't it? Going to whole of a country, whole of a culture. What made you make that big decision?
So by the time I decided to move, a couple of things had happened. One, in terms of transitions in life, I felt like I'd made a lot of the logical transitions and that I didn't see any pathways in front of me that led to more and interesting kind of stepping stones and adventures and, this kind of thing, right? I had already done the games thing. I'd done the movie thing. I'd done the TV commercial stuff in Hollywood. I'd hobnobbed with celebrities and I'd, traveled the world. And I mean, it was like, I felt like my options in the US were were narrowing. Every time I turned one direction or another, it was like I was kind of being channeled into something, and I still felt I wanted exploration and freedom. But the other big thing was political. At that time, because I was always very much anti-war, when I was living in San Francisco, I got really switched on to the anti-war movement, and I started to become very concerned about American foreign policy. And then 9/11 happened, and then you get these attacks, unjustified attacks by American military in places around the world. And I just got really angry because I tried to engage politically with the system. And then I came to the realization that the system in the United States is designed as a distraction to give you the illusion that you can do something about this stuff when in fact you cannot. Yeah. And I figured that the best way for me to act on my morals and principles was to reduce the amount of money that I was putting into the system. So as an American citizen with a passport and a social security number, you can never exactly escape taxation. Doesn't matter where you go in the world. But you can reduce your overall taxation. And I also felt that if I moved to somewhere far away like China, I would somehow remove myself from the influence of the United States. Now, 20 years later, I don't know if you're paying attention to the headlines these days, but America has decided that China is its number one enemy. And, you've got all of this nonsense going on and talking about somehow trying to go to war with China. And I'm just like, guys, this is really, really, really stupid. Having lived here for as long as I have, I can tell you that no one here has any desire for this kind of conflict. And it's really frustrating to me, again, coming back as an American citizen, to watch this insane, out of control American foreign policy stirring up trouble in all these places around the world. And it's like, it never changes, right? And now somehow it's come back home to me here where I live with my family here in China. So So anyway, that was the other big reason why I left. I thought I could get away from it, but yeah.
And when you moved to China, were you always going to sort of continue working in games, or were you almost going to have
Yeah, well, I moved. So the initial move was to Hong Kong. And
right, okay,
I went to work for a developer there. I made a really terrible game called Bad Day LA. That's a whole nother story. We can talk about another time. Simple version of that story, though, is that the guy spending the money demanded something of me and the team that they were incapable of producing, but we went ahead and tried to do it anyway. But the positive that came out of it definitely was not that game, but it was the fact that I then got introduced to the mainland of China. I visited Shanghai for the first time, and back then, Shanghai was like crazy. It was like the Wild West, and you had all these people coming from all over the world who were investing and building, and it was this crazy blank slate. It felt like this weirdo, barrels with fire, next to glittering skyscraper. It was bonkers. And I was just like, this is the place I want to be. I could feel the energy of it. Just like, this is where the center of the world is going to end up. And I just knew it. So I left Hong Kong and moved to Shanghai, and in the subsequent, how I moved here in, I think it's been 16 years. Like the whole world has shifted around now, right? Shanghai has become the epicenter of Asia, financial and manufacturing and shipping. And of course, China has now become this crazy global superpower. So it's been such a bizarre perspective to be here and to watch this is it's world-changing history. It's just bonkers. So I don't know. I feel like I landed exactly where I should be. I still find that the city and the country is incredible. It's inspiring. I just wish that people in the world outside were given an opportunity to really understand how things work here, because the misperceptions and the intentional misunderstandings or the intentional misrepresentations of the reality here are really sad. And it's really unfortunate that the people outside can't know that there's this wonderful country with wonderful people and a wonderful system of government that actually takes care of people first and foremost. And nobody knows that because people in the West don't want you to know that the system of government here can operate incredibly well and efficiently, and that so many people are being lifted out of poverty and so much is being improved constantly. But it doesn't do the politicians in the West any good for you to know that they're failing while this system is working, right? So, yeah.
No, thank you. You're right, though. The media attention we get is not always positive about China. Even in the UK, it's like, the media's being sort of
I saw
down. And,
you've got Liz Truss coming out with posters that say that she's going to make China the number one focus of her battle to regain UK supremacy or something, right? It's like, okay, well, hey, bring the opium boats back up the rivers and, force the Chinese at gunpoint and, to being drug addicts. I mean, I don't know.
It's crazy.
I think that, first of all, you're probably going to get a bunch of comments on this video where people are saying that I'm a traitor or that I'm a CPC shill or I'm paid to say these things. And I just want to say to the people who say that want to write those comments, that you're being ridiculous, that there are different systems in the world that operate differently than what you know. And just because you don't agree with what someone says or with their experience or what they live does not necessarily mean that that person has to be paid in order to say that. I think it says a lot about the people who think that way to project that onto other people that, oh, well, you couldn't possibly think differently from me without some sort of incentive or payment or whatever. And it's really unfortunate because when you narrow your mindset down like that, it makes it impossible for the world to be a better place. It makes it impossible for people to understand each other. And I wish that people would look at someone like me and be like, hey, there's a guy that I respect. Maybe I could trust a little bit, certainly more than we trust the media and the politicians these days. He's got 16 years experience on the ground living in China, and he's telling me that it's not the thing that the Western media is telling me it is. And honestly, the only thing you could tell me that I'm perhaps compromised on is if somehow the Chinese government is paying me, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about who pays the bills of the politicians in your country, who pays the bills of the media in your country. Go look that stuff up. If it's the pharmaceutical industry and it's the weapons industries, then maybe I'm not the one that you should be distrustful of, right? So I don't know. Anyway,
No, it's really interesting, America. Yeah. It's really interesting getting insight about that different, the other side of the world, actually, because it is good to hear this sort of stuff. Thank you. You're working on the third Alice game, Alice Asylum. How far is it? Is it almost complete? I would love to know when can we expect to see it? How is it going to go into different directions? Are you happy to reveal a bit?
So we technically cannot turn on a computer and fire up a game engine around this project at all until we get permission from EA to do so, which we do not have. But what we do have is a team that's working on pre-production, which means we're doing all the story and all the game design, and we're putting all that into a thing called a design Bible. So when it's done, it's going to be 300 or 400 pages of imagine if you took a video game and you turned it into a graphic novel, but in a sort of design format, right? People can go and check it out, what it looks like right now over on my Patreon. It's totally free to do. There's PDF versions of this that you can download. And so you can get a sense for what it is that we're building. And that's going to be finished by the end of this year. And then what we're hoping to do at the start of next year is to take that design Bible plus the budget and the schedule and all of the pieces that you would need as a potential investor, take that out to people who are interested in funding these kinds of things and secure the funding, and then we can go off to develop the game. These days, we've recently linked up with a developer who can help us to make this all a reality. So we've sort of completed two of the critical pieces necessary to make this happen. One is the design stuff, which will be finished by the end of this year. Two is the development resource, which we've just linked up with. And three is we've got to go out and get the money, which is what we're planning to do next year.
Well, really good luck. And I have had a look on your website, actually, and it does look really interesting. I'll put your Patreon link in the show notes if people want to check it out.
Sure.
It does look amazing. I'm looking forward to it. And I guess when it is released, it'll be on hopefully all platforms, PC, consoles, I guess.
Yeah, we hope so. I mean, certainly I don't want to make anything that's less than what we did with Madness Returns. So the ambition is, next gen console, AAA, action adventure, narrative driven single player type game, just updated for the modern era. Right. And I mean, people please go check out all the stuff on Patreon. We're constantly sharing tons of amazing art and story. And so there's plenty of stuff there for people to dive into. Massive, spoiler warnings though, because like the whole thing is laid out there, right? Wow. So be careful where you click if you're concerned about spoilers.
Good stuff. I'm looking forward to it. Really, I know we haven't got long left, American. I appreciate it, but really quickly, the Oz game, the Wizard of Oz game you're working on, that looked interesting. That almost took you for like another famous sort of story. With your stamp on it, of course, but how come that never got completed, if you don't mind me asking?
I think that's my it's my cursed project. I don't know. I'm trying to think of it's not an albatross because it's not really dragging me down, but it's like I don't know. I'm trying to think of an analogy for something that like you carry around, but you can never finish. What's the guy who pushes the rock up the Sisyphus or whatever, pushes the rock up the mountain? That's my rock.
Monkey on your back as well.
And I would be fine to leave it alone, but a lot of people out there will come at me online and be like, hey, do this Oz thing, do the Oz thing, do the Oz thing. So we've tried a number of different restarts to it, and we have a new restart of it that's presented up over on Patreon. That is also being potentially developed as a TV series. I don't know. It's so weird these days now. Like I'll sit down and I'll work with my team and we'll do a bunch of art and story and stuff around one of these Oz ideas. And I just feel like I'm building like a cursed thing. I think like, why are we putting energy into this? Because I know it's just going to like catch on fire and burn down in the end anyway. So because that was what happened. The first one, we did an Oz game. At that time, we were working for Atari Infogrames. That's who was giving us the money. That was a studio in Northern California. We had an original Xbox playable game of that. You can go on YouTube and find some of the footage. It looked great. It was really beautiful, had amazing music and art. And then Atari ran out of money and they called us up and were like, hey guys, sorry, we're bankrupt. So you guys are dead. And then I had a second go at it and I managed to sell that as a film concept and a game concept to Disney through Jerry Bruckheimer's production company. They paid us a lot of money for it. Eventually they asked me to write the script and then they just put it all in a box and it just disappeared. And then I tried again at Spicy Horse. We tried to build something called Oz Zombie, and we tried to do a Kickstarter, and that failed. It was too ambitious, and it was too unclear. So I don't know.
American.
Look, I don't know if you can see this stuff off screen or not, but these days we're making plush toys. Right? Because I'm in China and my wife is a fashion designer and we have access to all these factories that do whatever, right? You can make anything in China, right? So we originally did one of these plushes as a kind of prop for the Alice character. And we sold it and it did exceptionally well. And so then we just started making more and more rabbits of different designs. And nowadays this business is going bonkers, right? So when you ask me like, hey, go and make an Oz, I don't want to mess with it. I'd rather just make more rabbits because they sell like crazy. People love them. There's no stress in it. There's no bugs. There's no, updates we have to push out. It's just nothing like that, right? So I don't know. I'm kind of enjoying just being in a space where we just focus on design and writing and we let other people do the game stuff. And, so yeah.
I appreciate it. Now, really interesting. Just a couple of quick fire questions at the end then. And obviously, Alice in Wonderland, famous. Actually, did the Lewis Carroll estate ever get in contact with you? Have you ever heard from them? Are they fans of your games by any chance, or don't you know? I've
done talks with the Lewis Carroll Society. Nothing ever from the estate that I'm aware of.
Right.
But, it's kind of funny because I remember when we released the original Alice game in 2000. I can't remember if it was like an open letter or if somebody actually sent me a letter from the society, the Lewis Carroll Society. But I remember getting some kind of communication that what I had done was the devil's work. And, how dare you do this, sir? But then years later, by the time of Madness Returns, people at the Lewis Carroll Society were very inviting and warm, and they would ask me to give talks or to come and visit them and stuff like that, which I did. So
that's cool.
It feels like now, at least that society embraces a lot of the different variations on the original story.
Kind of linked to that, is there any other novels or famous stories you would love to adapt in your own style? Is there any, I spoke about Oz, obviously Wizard of Oz, but is there any others that you thought, wow, this would be pretty cool?
Honestly, I don't know. We did Red Riding Hood as something called Akiniro, and that got made into a game, and now it's also being developed into a potential TV series, animated series. So I'm kind of toying around with that and helping the guys that are doing that as well. I don't know. These days, not so much. We have two kids that are very small. One is 3 years old and one is 2 months.
Wow.
2 months old.
You got your hands full,
and that really takes up a lot of time. So I've done this kind of upside down from the way a lot of people do it in life. I had a very crazy, very active 20 to 45-year-old life. Traveled the world, started companies, moved to China, did all this crazy stuff. And then a few years ago, my wife and I were like, let's have some kids. And most people do that in their 20s, and then around this time they're retiring. Well, so this is my new main focus, though, raising kids. And we work at home here, and we do the plush stuff, and I do writing, and it's no stress, and I get to spend a bunch of time with the kids, and so that's kind of where it's at these days. I'm not really thinking about new story ideas these days.
No, fair enough, and I'm happy. I'm happy you really you seem very happy in your life at the moment. So good on you. Couple final questions. This is a tough question though, but have you got what are your 3 favorite video games of all time?
I don't know. I'll just tell you the ones I played recently. I really enjoyed Days Gone. I'd say that one of the early Grand Theft Autos was I think it was GTA 3. It would have to be called one of my favorite games because I remember buying and breaking the disc and buying and breaking and buying and breaking like 4 or 5 times because I was so addicted to it. And I liked the later versions, but somehow that was the one that really got me like addicted, right? I'm trying to think of another recent or a long time ago one. I don't know. There's so many. I was a big fan of BioShock back in that. But I don't know. This is a really hard one. Like if you try to ask me like what's your favorite movie or I don't really do those types of questions very well.
Yeah. Fair enough. Have you seen the Alice in Wonderland film, the one with Johnny Depp? Obviously that came out after your games, didn't it? But
I felt they were crap.
Yep. I didn't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm not really. Yeah, the original Disney one. Are you a fan of that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think the original is good, and I think there's a lot of adaptations out there that have been all right. But there was something in that film that made me so angry, and it wasn't the stupid Johnny Depp dancing part at the end. There was this whole movie you watch where it's supposed to be this girl who's doing her coming of age story, and she's developing and transforming into a woman. And at some point, right when she's about to go and do the finale battle against the boss monster, which was the Jabberwock, someone says, you don't have to do anything. Just let the knife do the work. And I thought, like, what a shit story. Like, why would you tell her that, like, you've done this whole journey and don't worry about it. The knife will do it. I'm like, what kind of crap is that? Can you imagine at the end of the Harry Potter movies, just like, he's facing off against
Voldemort,
where that freaking thing was. And then somebody being like, "Don't worry, Harry, just let the wand do the work." Like what?
Yeah, it's true.
I don't know. Maybe that was their attempt to do like a trust the force type of thing, but it really fell flat on its face. And I wanted to walk. And then they followed that up with that dance thing, which I just felt like was so insulting to everybody that was sitting in the audience. It was like a middle finger, like, haha, you watch this now. Like, here's the stupid dance thing, like, what the hell?
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, I didn't like those movies at all.
No, I'm not. I thought it was a silly film, actually. Look, American, I've had a really good chat, and I really appreciate your time. I think it's been, I appreciate your honesty. I appreciate you sharing, really just answering the questions really openly. So thank you. We always ask our guests this final question. So quite a tough question as well. But if you could share a few drinks with any video game character, who would you choose and why? We did kind of mention the Mad Hat already, to be fair.
So, the guy that we brought on board to do the writing for the Alice TV show is named David Hayter, and he's the voice of Solid Snake. And first of all, when I heard that he was hired on, I was like, yeah. And second of all, because I'd actually gone as the box for Halloween one year, like the sneaking around box, And so we've managed to have some Skype, Zoom type calls, but I've never met him in person. So I think as a cheat, as a way of getting to go and have a drink with David, I would say Solid Snake, and then hopefully he would be the one that would show up.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. We really hope you enjoyed it. You can tweet us at Arcade Attack UK. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/Arcade Attack UK. Check out our website at arcadeattack.co.uk for lots more retro gaming goodness and to delve into our archives. Our podcasts are also available on Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Please leave us a review and a rating, we'd really appreciate it. If you'd like to support Arcade Attack, please check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/arcadeattack, which will give you access to exclusive podcasts, interviews and other bonus content. So, until next time, take care and we'll speak to you soon.